We're back. In this segment, I want to talk briefly about the coming of the African slaves. Um, we did say 1607 is Jamestown, and 2 years later, um, it's a grim reminder that it only took a few years before um, the African slave trade to take a foothold to gain a foothold and take hold in North America. It so by 1680, most Africans that inhabited the English colonies were slaves, and very few were free men and women. After 1680, the population of enslaved people, grew very rapidly. And by 1775, the year uh, the year that we first contemplated independence and the first shots were fired of the American Revolution, by 1775, there are 400,000 slaves, enslaved men and women and children in the 13 colonies. And most of them, as I said, not exclusively, but most of them are in the southern colonies because of plantation farming. Uh, the largest number of immigrants can be found between 1680 and 1750. And I'm sorry, the largest number of immigrants between 1680 and 1750 are from Africa, and slaves from African, Af- excuse me, pardon me, enslaved people from Africa and the West Indies. Let me say that again. The largest number of immigrants to the English colonies between 1680 and 1750 are enslaved Africans and enslaved West Indians. And the slave population continued to grow very rapidly. By 1680, 1690, it is growing very rapidly because of the triangle trade. And I'll explain more about that in just a little while. By 1720, Virginia's population was 25% slave, and by 1750, it was 41%, coming in on the side of almost 1 in 2 inhabitants of Virginia were slaves, enslaved men and women and children. Um, the reason for this is the South looked upon slavery as having absolutely no opposition to slavery. Um, it was held as a value that um, uh, you could hold slaves, and down south on the plantations, the um, the idea of slave or indentured servant. Well, the colony of Georgia is going to be founded by indentured servants, mostly men who were working off their in, indebtedness in England. As we said, that was a crime in England, and you could get yourself out of jail uh, by signing on to being an indentured servant. Uh, so that was not a permanent enslavement. Once your term of work for the creditor, the person you were indebted to, once that term was over with, once you had worked off your debt, you were then in the New World, and then you could choose to go back to the old to old merry old England, or you could stay in this New World and basically start over again with a new life. Slavery was preferred, and slavery was profitable because slavery was permanent. You were not going to most likely you were not going to free these your slaves, um, and therefore you owned you were a recipient of free labor, and that was going to be permanent, and that it was permanent because the slaves, again, were not going to be free unless you actually allowed them to be. The slave trade and the enslavement of Africans was based upon birth and race. Okay, and only Africans and Indians could be enslaved. The children with African mothers were slaves. The idea that the slave trade, the west coast of Africa was where these trading posts existed, and the um, the enslaved Africans were brought in from the interior. They were captured. Sometimes they were the vanquished in war, and the victors of those wars, the kings and princes of the tribes that were victorious, would enslave the vanquished and make them slaves, and then the slaves were sold to European and Arabian slave traders who brought them out to the coast, put them on ships, and then what occurred next is what is called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is the part of the journey from Africa that took the enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean. It was said that possibly was the worst part of their enslaved lives. 10 to 50% of the Africans died in passage. Excuse me just one second. So the vanquished were then sold to slave traders on the west, like I said, the west coast of Africa, nations like Liberia today, Mauritania, Cote d'Ivoire, and from there they were purchased by slave traders and again put on ships for the Middle Passage to the West Indies to work on plantations in the West Indies, in the Caribbean, most likely sugar again, and sugar, rice, and as well as the southern colonies with their plantations of the tobacco and rice, and eventually as well as cotton. Okay. The final passage then were the auctions in the various ports all along the coast of the colonies, in Charleston and working their way up. These enslaved Africans were when they were put on the auction block, they had already been branded with a hot branding iron in Africa, and then they would be branded again with the brand of their owners here. And 1/3 of the slaves that the enslaved men and women and children that came from Africa did not make it past their first year of living in the New World. It says that by 1775, 20%, by 1775, 20% in the English colonies in North America, the 20% of the population was slaves, and again, most of them, but not all of them, could be found and were found in the South. Slaves brought new crops and a variety of skills, and that's an important point that we'll talk about more as we go along. Many of them were just hard laborers in the working in the tough conditions of the plantation, but many of them became very, very highly skilled workers, carpenters and masons and blacksmiths and coopers and cobblers. Okay, these were skills that, if they were not enslaved, they would be they would in a town or a village in the English colonies. They would be prized as someone that having a skill would be valued and could help the economy and the culture of a town or a city to grow. Um, it said that slave life varied across the colonies. As I said, most of them uh, worked in agriculture or domestic servitude. 80% lived on large plantations. Only 1 in 5 Southerners owned slaves. Um, in the North, in New England, and in the middle colonies, you would find, if you found slaves, and you would, in towns and villages and on farms, um, and mostly they would be domestic servants. Okay, but once again, it varied. You may find them like you would um, in just in Westchester County. There is a mill town where um, the owner basically he was an absentee landlord and allowed the slaves to run his grist mill, his grain mill, and they basically ran the whole show. And he would show up every once in a while and just collect what they had worked on, and collect the profits from the milling. Um, most in the New England and middle colonies, most if you were a slave owner, you most likely owned a household slave or two, and that's not in any way condoning anything, but as opposed to what existed in the southern plantations. Um, Slaves lived on as family units. There was no such thing as legal marriage, um, but informally it was allowed because it maintained some kind of it, it allowed the enslaved people to have some kind of a normalcy, and it basically placated them, and that was a good thing if you were a slave owner, I guess, to maintain control. Uh, of course, what would make it more profitable, and we'll talk about this more later on, uh, the fact that enslaved African men and women were forced to breed so that they could produce new enslaved children. Uh, and of course, the rape and rape was a common practice among the masters and enslaved people. Um, and sometimes that would lead to the women who were raped to receive, ironically, better treatment by the master in some ways. Anyway, we will talk more about slavery and in the colonies as we go along, because it is the story of our founding, and it's the story of the United States of America, and that will come up again and again and again.